Letting everybody know that we are currently recording this. Thank you very much, and good afternoon and welcome everybody. And just like to welcome any Indigenous and First Nations people that are joining us today, and I'd like to acknowledge them and elders past, present and emerging for the continued custodianships of the lands and waterways in which we pass through today. And I'm on Camaragal lands today. Welcome everybody to Mark's pointy end of his thesis, his final year review. So before I hand it over to Mark, I would just like to introduce the final year review panel today. The expert panel members is Associate Professor Megan Willis. Thank you for joining us, as well as Dr. Emma Bradshaw. Welcome. And they're all led by the most competent, most excellent chair, Professor Rhonda Craven. And also like to acknowledge Mark's supervisory panel, led by Professor Joseph Sirocci, co-supervisor Professor Baljinder Sadra, and the Associate Supervisor Spencer Smith, who's the Executive Director for the Institute for Better Health. And without any further ado, Mark, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ricky. Hello, everyone. It's great to be here with you this afternoon. Thanks for taking the time to hear my presentation, and a special thanks to the panel for their presence and willingness to lend me their expertise. The name of my thesis, and hence this presentation, is Heterogeneity in the Daily Meaning Affect Link, Evidence for Stoic and Non-Stoic Patterns in Everyday Life. And we're going to dive a bit more deeply into what that means in just a second. I've got three parts to my presentation today. The introduction and background will mainly be a summary of my first study, which was a systematic review and meta-analysis. Study 2 will be a detailed overview of my daily diary study and the focus of my presentation, and then a very short bit at the end about practicals and what happens next. My supervisor is Professor Joseph Chiarocci. My co-supervisor is Baljinder Sadra. I'd like to take a moment to thank Joseph, who's met with me almost every week for the last 5 years to help guide me through this crazy thing called a PhD. He's been very patient with me. Maybe one day I'll even meet him in person. I'm the Associate Director of Mission and Ministry here at ACU. I love people answer the big questions about life, like how to find meaning and purpose. And this is what has led me to this role and to this topic of research. So let's go. I'm going to briefly summarize Study 1 because it provides the rationale for Study 2. So these are the questions that we addressed in Study 1. What is the size of the meaning-affect relationship? What is its heterogeneity? And what are the possible sources of that? We expected a moderate positive meaning-affect relationship and substantial heterogeneity, consistent with non-ergodicity. We used keywords from these three different categories, and we used these four databases to conduct our search. Eligibility criteria required intensive longitudinal data collection for both eudaimonic and hedonic well-being that were published in an academic journal and had full text available. Using these methods, we started with 598 studies, 254 of which were duplicates and removed. 2 independent assessors screened 344 papers by title and abstract. 56 papers had the full text assessed, after which 37 were included in our systematic review. The correlations from each of these studies was systematically extracted into a wonderful large spreadsheet that looked a bit like this. The basic results by the numbers, 37 papers met our inclusion and exclusion criteria. The most common measure of eudaimonic well-being that we found was meaning in life, or MIL. The most common measure of hedonic well-being, or HWB, was affect, or mood. 14 of the papers were included in the meta-analysis. Only 7 of the papers examined the connection between eudaimonic and hedonic well-being directly. From these 14 papers, 51 effects were drawn for a meta-analysis. Only one of the 37 papers, out of the whole study, was interested in the heterogeneity of this connection. Here's the summary table of our results, and I'm going to use that to answer our 3 research questions. So what is the magnitude of the connection between eudaimonic well-being and hedonic well-being? Well, the overall pooled effect from our meta-analysis was 0.39 for a random effect model. What is the heterogeneity of this relationship? Well, the I-squared, which is the proportion of the between-study heterogeneity, was over 92%. which indicates that the average effect for meaning mood in our meta-analysis did not do a good job of explaining the effects found in the different studies. What factors account for this heterogeneity? Looking at the difference between the pooled effects for positive affect and negative affect, it seems that valence is a key moderating factor. I'd like to make 3 main points to wrap up study 1. Number 1, research in this area is scarce. Only 7 of the 37 studies directly examined the eudaimonic to hedonic well-being link, and only 1 study looked at its heterogeneity. Number 2, we found a huge amount of heterogeneity, which just means that effects vary substantially across studies. This points to something deeper going on. And number 3, prior research has identified 2 distinct patterns where valued action, which is not eudaimonic well-being directly, but a close proxy, and hedonic well-being appear tightly coupled for some, but not for others. And this gives us perhaps some clues of things that we should look for in our next study, which is exactly what we did in our daily diary study. So in response to these findings, we set out to explore this heterogeneity further. Our research questions were the same as study 1, with the addition of the 2 new questions in red. To answer these questions, we designed a study that included the collection of intensive longitudinal data about clinically relevant processes and outcomes connected to daily meaning in life, daily affect, and daily spirituality. Following ethical approval, participants were recruited through social media. They completed consent and baseline measures. Then they used the PsychFlex app to complete twice daily surveys for 30 out of 35 days. Eligibility required participants to be healthy, English-speaking adults with smartphone access. A total of 104 individuals expressed interest in the study. Following data quality screening, 78 participants were retained for analysis. They contributed 5,282 scheduled observations, with an average of 65 responses per participant, with a range from 20, which was the lower bound, up to 241 responses, which was the upper bound. Of these 78 people, 53 participants completed the study. They made it twice a day, 30 out of 35 days. And completers had a mean age of 38, 58% were male, and most resided in Australia. Other demographic information collected was related to nationality, English fluency, occupation, and religious practice. Now let's talk about measures. Our baseline measure was trait meaning in life, which was measured using the comprehensive measure of meaning designed by Hansen and Vanderweel in 2019, which assesses the 3 major domains of meaning in life: coherence, significance, and direction, each of which you can see has subdomains. Responses were collected at both baseline, so before they started the daily diary, and at the end, 30 to 35 days later, to examine changes in meaning in life over time. Our daily surveys assessed 4 different components: eudaimonic well-being, operationalized as meaning in life; hedonic well-being, operationalized as positive affect, enthusiasm, or negative affect, upset; spirituality from the daily spiritual experience scale; and daily behavioral processes as measured by the process-based assessment tool, or PBAT. Before testing any of our hypotheses or starting analysis, we examined the data quality and missingness. Missingness was approximately 23% and was primarily missed prompts, so whole surveys, rather than item non-response. No problematic response patterns were detected, such as long stringing or flat responding, and all retained participants met the minimum threshold of 20 observations, which is what we needed for statistical power. The skewness and kurtosis measures showed acceptable distributions, meaning the data was normal, and the interclass correlations ranged from 0.41 to 0.55, indicating that there was meaningful within-person variability. Overall, the data was high quality and suited for planned analyses. At the between-person level, participants with higher average meaning tended to be more spiritual, less upset, and somewhat more enthusiastic. These findings all aligned with existing theory. However, our research questions are not how people differ from one another on average, but whether meaning and affect move together within individuals across days. So to answer that question, we now turn to the within-person analysis. The pooled analyses replicated the previous meta-analysis. Meaning was positively associated with enthusiasm and only weakly related to upset. But the main story here, again, is the heterogeneity, which was around 70 to 75% of the variation reflected, which reflects genuine between-person differences. This suggests that the average effect may mask distinct underlying patterns, leading directly to our research question: do Stoic and non-Stoic subgroups exist within our data? At this point, we decompose the sample into two groups. Approximately 1/3 of participants, 28 of the 78, or 36%, showed a non-Stoic profile, while 2/3, n equals 50, or 64%, showed a Stoic profile. Non-Stoics showed strong meaning-affect coupling, whereas Stoics showed little or none. The average effect, the black one, was masking two distinct patterns: the pattern of the non-Stoic in the green and of the Stoic in the blue. This figure visualizes the central argument of the chapter. It's showing similar information to the last, but displaying it visually in a different way. What you can see here is that non-Stoics show strong and consistent coupling between meaning and affect. Higher meaning predicts greater enthusiasm and lower upset. Stoics show little or no coupling, with coefficients clustered around 0. The important point is that the average effect conceals two very different patterns. For some people, meaning and mood are tightly linked. For others, they are largely independent. This suggests that heterogeneity in the meaning-affect relationship reflects two distinct psychological organizations, rather than statistical error. Next, we compare the average daily experiences of the Stoic and non-Stoic groups. Here, the groups were remarkably similar. They reported comparable daily levels of meaning, spirituality, enthusiasm, upset, and most behavioral processes. Here, only 3 behavioral differences emerged. Non-Stoics reported a wider emotional range, while Stoics reported more health-harming behaviors or fewer meaningful challenges. The key takeaway here is that Stoics and non-Stoics do not appear to be different in how much meaning or well-being they experience overall. Rather, the distinction seems to lie in how these daily experiences are organized and how they connect to meaning and affect. So the distinction is organizational rather than quantitative. We then examined the two groups to see where they were different in how the 4 outcomes, positive affect, negative affect, meaning, and spirituality, were connected to the 18 PBAT processes. You can see from our coupling matrix that for non-Stoics, almost every daily process was significantly linked to enthusiasm, upset, meaning, and spirituality. For Stoics, the same processes showed far weaker, less consistent, and often non-significant relationships. Now, to dive into this a bit more deeply, in the next slide, we're going to take a look just at one outcome, and that's enthusiasm, to see how it connects to the PBAT processes differently for the two groups. So what you can see here is that for non-Stoics, the pattern is remarkably coherent. Positive processes, such as doing important things, connecting with others, finding meaningful challenge, they're all associated with higher enthusiasm, Well, negative processes like hurting connection or no meaningful challenge were associated with lower enthusiasm. All 18 relationships are significant, and they're all in the expected or coherent direction. For Stoics, the same processes are linked to enthusiasm, but much more weakly. So positive processes still did predict enthusiasm, but the effects are substantially smaller. For negative processes, many associations disappear entirely, and some even move in the opposite, or what we're calling counter-normative direction. The takeaway here is that Stoics and non-Stoics are not distinguished by what they do each day, but by how strongly these daily processes are translated into their affective, positive and negative affect, into their affective experience. Now, returning to our coupling matrix summary, let's just look at this again. So we just looked at enthusiasm. Now take a look at upset, at meaning, at spirituality. I think overall, this is what I want to say to you from this functional analysis. If the Stoic versus non-Stoic difference was only visible in the meaning to affect relationship, meaning to enthusiasm or meaning to upset, maybe if we were skeptical, we could say it's an artifact of one measure or one modeling decision. Once that same distinction appears across a large number of process outcome couplings, maybe the simpler interpretation is that it reflects a genuine difference in how people experience life. And that key difference is that for non-Stoics, daily behavioral processes are consistently linked to positive affect, meaning in life, and reduced negative affect. For Stoics, fewer daily behavioral processes are linked to outcomes. And where those links do exist, they are weaker and less consistent. Okay. Moving on now from the functional analysis, I want to tell you about some more differences that we found between these two groups. So in this analysis, we examined 3 indicators: variability, emotional range, and autocorrelation for differences between the groups for each of the daily outcomes. Interestingly, no group differences emerged for meaning, for spirituality, or for enthusiasm. They were all the same. However, all 3 indicators were significantly different for upset. Non-Stoics showed larger swings in upset, a wider emotional range, and greater emotional carryover from one day to the next. Stoics appear generally more emotionally stable, with less variation in upset, a smaller range, and no emotional carryover from one day to the next of their negative affect. So this completes our analysis of the daily measures, and now I'd like to turn your attention back to the trait meaning in life, as measured by the comprehensive measure of meaning that I showed you before. Just a reminder, there's the 3 domains: coherence, significance, and direction, and those 7 subdomains. So what we can clearly see here from the comprehensive measure of meaning data from before the daily surveys is that there does seem to be a clear difference for every subdomain for direction and significance between Stoics and non-Stoics. Interestingly, coherence and its 2 subdomains were not different for the 2 groups. This suggests Stoics differ in directional and significance-related aspects of meaning rather than in how life makes sense or in coherence. We then examined the 49 participants who completed both the pre and the post survey to see whether meaning in life changed over the month and whether that change was different between Stoics and non-Stoics. You can see here is that across the whole sample, all 7 meaning subdomains increased significantly from pre to post survey. The largest gains were in goals, mission, and global coherence, suggesting participants generally reported greater meaning, direction, and coherence by the end of the study. However, because there was no control group, there wasn't a group that didn't do the daily diary, we can't determine any causality here. we can only conclude that meaning scores rose systematically from time 1 to time 2. Importantly as well, there was no statistically significant difference between the groups, between Stoics and non-Stoics, in the amount of change that happened over this time. Both groups improved, but they improved by a similar extent. When all of these findings are considered together, the key distinction between Stoics and non-Stoics appears to be organizational rather than scalar. Non-Stoics showed strong coupling between meaning, affect, and daily processes, suggesting a broadly responsive psychological system. Stoics showed weaker coupling, fewer significant process-to-outcome relationships, and greater emotional stability, suggesting a narrower and less effectively responsive system. The groups were similar in their average values. The differences emerged not in the quantity of experience, but in how those experiences connected dynamically to our outcomes. All of this taken together, the findings suggest two different organizations of daily psychological functioning and two different ways that meaning in life may operate in everyday life. Time to conclude. This slide captures what I see as a central contribution of the chapter. When we look at the data at the aggregate level, the conclusion appears relatively straightforward. Meaning and affect are positively related in daily life. That's exactly what both the systematic review and the pooled analyses suggested. However, when we unpack that average, a much more interesting picture emerges. The daily meaning affect link is not organized in the same way for everyone. Instead, the evidence suggests at least two distinct patterns. For non-Stoics, meaning was strongly linked to greater enthusiasm and lower upset. And this relationship was embedded within a broad network of daily processes that were consistently connected to meaning, affect, and spirituality in a coherent way. For Stoics, meaning was much more weakly linked to affect and embedded within a narrower and more stable pattern of functioning, characterized by fewer significant process outcome relationships and reduced emotional reactivity. Importantly, this distinction is not confined to a single coefficient. It generalized across a broad range of daily process to outcome relationships, suggesting that we are observing different organizations of daily psychological functioning rather than random variation. Taken together, these findings lead to three key conclusions. Number one, the daily meaning affect link is genuinely heterogeneous. Number two, that heterogeneity appears structured into the Stoic and non-Stoic groups rather than being random. And number three, meaning may operate through more than one psychological pathway in everyday life for different people. The contribution of this chapter is not that meaning and affect are related. We already knew that. The contribution is showing that this relationship appears to operate in fundamentally different ways across different people. Finally, some practicals. Looking at my timer, here's something practical. I have run out of time. So let me summarize this section quickly by saying we have completed most of our statistical analysis. There's possibly one further test that we want to run, but most of that is done. That's the good news. The bad news, or the realistic news perhaps for me, is that there's still a lot of writing to do, particularly around my discussion before submission. Probably about 20,000 more words that I need to complete. Again, mainly in that discussion area, and then I should be ready to submit. So there you go. Thank you, everyone. I've talked for a very long time now. I'd love to be able to answer any of your questions. Thank you.
Oh, thank you, Mark. Well done. I'm not sure, was it very stoic or non-stoic of your efforts? Rhonda, I'll hand over to you to facilitate the Q&A. Thank you.
Great. Thanks very much, Mark. Before I just open the floor for questions to the panel, can I ask you, could you just give us an overview of what the structure of your thesis is? How many chapters are there and how many of them are completed?
So it's not finalized yet, but I'm thinking that I'm going to probably have 5 or 6 chapters overall. So here for the final year review, I completed 2 chapters. My mid-Cambridge review, I submitted 1 chapter, and then my introduction for my confirmation was probably another chapter. Definitely some work to be done in kind of getting the flow right between those 3. And as I said at the end there, definitely an emphasis on the discussion portion and making sure that I get that right. As you could see, the difference between the written document, which had tons and tons of tables in the presentation, is that, yeah, I just did not have time to touch on a lot of things in this space. Joe kept going less, you know, for the presentation. But there is a lot of things that I can talk about in my discussion. So I am excited to do that. It's just, yeah, I think some time to do that would be good now.
Okay, great. Thanks for that clarification, Mark. I'd like to open the floor to the panel first for any questions.
All right, I'll go first. Thanks for your presentation, Mark. You know, and also the slides were really clear, and I thought you did a really good job of kind of presenting what is a lot of analyses in a really clear way there. One thing I wanted to ask, and in reading the kind of SLR and meta-analysis chapter, like one of the conclusions you made was that the heterogeneity in the meta-analysis may mean that there's heterogeneity between people. And I didn't quite follow the logic of that jump. So I was wondering if you can kind of unpack that a little bit for me.
Thanks, Megan. I was probably not as clear as I should have been. Probably what I meant is that points to the fact that there are true different effects that they're finding in the studies. It's not necessarily about the people. I might have muddled that up. My understanding of the I squared is that it's about the difference between the studies' effects.
Yeah, that's my understanding too. So I think that you might want to have a little bit of a look at that. The other question I had, and maybe I missed it, but how do you separate out the Stoics and the non-Stoics in the second chapter?
Sure. That came from basically looking at the way that they were coupling. So the forest plot is probably the simplest way to see that. So we would take each person's, you know, their connection between affect and meaning. That's where we started. And look at that and to see, were they coupling in that coherent direction or the not coherent direction? And when you would start to get the visual, then you could dive more deeply into each person to take a look at them more specifically to try to figure out. And that there were some that kind of, you know, are kind of in the middle or sat on some borders. But actually for a lot of them, it was quite clear from the beginning.
Yeah, like I kind of understand it, but I think you haven't really explained in that chapter, like how you've actually decided which group they get assigned to.
Sure.
That's more that I think a bit more detail on that would be good. I have some other like more minor comments, which I'm happy to pass on to you, but you know, well done on, you know, that it's a huge study doing this experience sampling work and all the analyses. So I'll hand it over to Emma.
Thank you for your comments. That's really helpful.
Thanks, Megan, and thanks, Mark, and congratulations. I think of your panel here today. I'm the only person who was on your earlier panels as well, so it's been really nice to see how far the research has come since the last time we heard from you. As you know, I care about the meaning variable a lot, and it's cool to see what you've done with it. I had a similar question to Megan's. It was not clear from the chapter, and I couldn't tell today either how the Stoics and the non-Stoics were split up in study 2. And I think we probably both mean that pretty literally, like, were there mean cutoffs wherein someone goes into one bucket and the other, or do those cutoffs vary by variable? I remember writing down something you said, through careful analysis, a group of Stoics and non-Stoics, groups of Stoics and non-Stoics were created, but it's not clear exactly how that happened. So I think that's a super important addition for your chapter.
Thank you. Yes.
But I had a more kind of conceptual question, because I mean, quite obviously, I think the funnest, coolest part of what you're delivering is the discussion about Stoics versus non-Stoics, which is, I mean, non-Stoics are sort of the normative, nomothetic group. I wonder if you've thought about what happens like before and after you are a Stoic. Like, what experiences do you think lead to someone being Stoic? And relatedly, do you think there are any contexts in which being a Stoic might be beneficial?
Sure. I'll start with the end, because I think that's the simpler part. Perhaps in highly emotive, perhaps stressful or dramatic situations, it could be helpful to have a less psychologically responsive, effective experience, in terms of perhaps persistence, resilience, That's my initial thoughts on the very end of your question.
Even though they experience more frequent upset than the non-Stoics, or did I hear that the wrong way around?
So the Stoics are the ones with the narrower range. And so they're the ones, and they're actually the bigger group. For most people, it seems that those connections aren't as, well, they're looser, right? They're not quite as tightly as coupled. And it seems like that's actually how most people go through life. The non-Stoics, where they're really tightly coupled, that's actually the much smaller group. And they seem to kind of ride the waves, the highs and the lows of life more fully, for that non-Stoic group. But I think in some ways it's simpler being a non-Stoic, because if you do meaningful things, you feel good about it. Whereas if you're a non-Stoic, you might put a lot of effort into trying to do something as meaningful and don't necessarily get maybe the effective reward that comes with some of that, So I do think you're right that different scenarios are going to call out, like, that there's strengths and weaknesses to both groups. There's clearly no right or wrong or better. It's just kind of, but I think there's clinical, a lot of clinical implications there. If I'm a
or even just
clinician,
practical, like, you don't even need to be kind of clinical in order to want to improve your life. I think it's a fairly standard recommendation that you add some meaning to your life in order to get that. And your research kind of complicates that advice.
It does, because I think you need to know what kind of person you are, or as a clinician, what kind of person you're working with, because it's probably going to impact the kinds of interventions you would recommend.
Very interesting. And how do people become Stoic versus non-Stoic? What do you think?
Look, I have absolutely no numbers that can point to any of this. So anecdotally, it does come down to nature and nurture, doesn't it? And chicken and egg, I'm not sure. It seems to me that it's clear that there is this embedded wiring, maybe, that exists. But yeah, I can't comment too much. It would be fully anecdotal, but
you might want to think about motivations.
Yeah.
Why people are motivated to pursue meaning. If they do it for more autonomous reasons, my guess is it would benefit them fully. Whereas if they're doing it because they've been told to, or they feel like they have to, or they feel guilty if they wouldn't, maybe it would complicate that link. Just a thought from my always talking about SDT perspective.
Great. And interesting on the PBAT processes to see that, they were only minor and there was only 3 of them, but those differences in terms of the narrow emotional range, Stoics hurting their health more and not seeking meaningful challenge as much, seem a bit happier to sit back a little bit more than the non-Stoics, who seem to get that kick out of, really going for things in life. Yeah.
Fantastic. Now I can open the floor to any other comments or questions.
Doesn't look like any, Rhonda.
Okay, fantastic. Well, thank you all for joining us today. Thank you, Mark, for a very exciting and interesting presentation. The panel will now meet and we will come back to you, Mark.
Thank you so much, Rhonda. Thank you, everyone. Really appreciate your time.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Just ask the panel and members to stay on board, and I'll just disconnect everyone else. Thanks very much, Mark. And to everybody, have a great afternoon and a great weekend.
Thanks, Ricky. Thanks for your help. See you guys.